The depths of the ocean are one of the scarier environments people can imagine being trapped in. Pitch dark areas with scary creatures lying in wait makes for a fantastic scenario to set a horror game in.
This ecological biome matches 7 of the 9 preconditions for stimulating terror in humans.
Which makes it all the more interesting that even though many people cite fear as the defining feeling Subnautica draws out of them, it's not what the developers of the game initially set out to do. While they did lean into the scarier aspects of the game throughout development, especially as they got more feedback in early access, Subnautica's developers wanted to create an immersive, underwater survival game taking inspiration from others in the genre like Minecraft. A few well-designed mechanics in particular stood out to me in this aspect and allowed myself and many others to become fully immersed in the game's ocean world, Planet 4546b. Even if you've never seen the game before, you've probably already picked up on some design choices in the game that serve to enhance immersion from the footage so far. To start, the user interface is very minimal, only displaying a limited amount of information at any one time. This serves to keep the player's focus on learning from the game world itself, instead of spending time searching the HUD to find something they're looking for. Something that might seem strange if you've never played Subnautica though, is that the largest of the icons on the display isn't actually the player's health. Well, sort of. See, with Subnautica being a survival game, it carries over several mechanics that are similar to others in its genre. Thirst and hunger meters are staples of survival games that reduce health or power when depleted, forcing players to engage with and plan out how to use their consumable items on a deeper level than in most other games. Subnautica has these meters on top of a more typical health bar that is probably the one players are least focused on when playing. What they will pay more attention to is the oxygen meter. How oxygen is used throughout Subnautica as a means of immersion and progression is one of the game's bigger innovations for the survival genre. See, lots of games of all different types have oxygen meters, but in a world submerged in a giant ocean, oxygen takes on a whole new importance. As you'd expect, oxygen in Subnautica decreases the longer the player is underwater, so new players will be constantly checking their gauge to see when they need to go back up for air. This cycle of breathe, dive, collect, and swim to the surface again is the main gameplay loop for the duration of the game. While there are dangerous creatures in the ocean, they aren't a constant presence and can be avoided once you learn their behaviors. The lack of combat means the health bar isn't as important in Subnautica and helps to place more emphasis on oxygen management. In this sense, players are much more literally versing the environment than in typical PvE environments that usually just mean attacking things that aren't other players. The fantasy of surviving on an alien planet is at the heart of Subnautica's design, which is why it engages players in a system that forces them to always be aware of their surroundings. Because it's such an important resource, oxygen is tied directly into Subnautica's progression. Shying away from the pure stat buffs and item tiers that are common in RPGs and survival games, upgrades in Subnautica are typically distinct and substantial. Taking oxygen, for example, players are able to dramatically increase the amount of oxygen they can maintain as they progress through the crafting tree. This can be done directly by making bigger oxygen tanks, or indirectly through building vehicles that can serve as oxygen pit stops on deeper dives. Speaking of vehicles, another mechanic that Subnautica uses to support immersion is pressure. As players dive deeper and deeper, they'll find their oxygen draining more quickly, and their vehicles will start to take damage. This is because of the increased pressure found at certain depth intervals that make it hard to survive at unless you have the right equipment. Pressure in this case acts as an immersive way to gate the player by making it inefficient to explore deeper biomes until they make enough progress in the crafting tree. Now, going down to a lower depth than your equipment can take doesn't immediately kill you, but instead offers gradual consequences that can be planned around, which prevents instant fail states from pulling the player right out of the experience. In a similar sense, running out of oxygen doesn't lead to death right away either, allowing players to make one final push to get some air before blacking out. Because the story begins with the player being the lone survivor of a ship crash on a world filled with water, you might expect the ship to feature prominently in the narrative and gameplay progression of Subnautica, and this turns out to be true. A large chunk of the early game is spent preparing to board the crashed ship before going in and looting it for all the resources that are left to find. While getting the Aurora is one of the cooler and potentially scarier moments in the game, I found it more interesting how the ship is used to help players navigate. A common game feature that is noticeably missing from Subnautica is a map. Never mind the nitpicks some players would have about using paper underwater and the planet being uncharted, whipping out a map whenever a player gets lost wouldn't contribute to immersion and might actually risk pulling players out of the experience. Subnautica's designers work around this in part by utilizing the ship as an environmental compass. Being the only landmark that is practically always visible, the aurora serves as an object that the player can orient themselves around. By popping up above the water and taking a look at the ship, players can learn at a glance how far away they are and which direction they're heading. Before getting access to a more traditional compass later in the game, knowing where you are in relation to the aurora is a vital tool that players will learn to keep track of. Now, using landmarks can have its downsides. In this case, when a player first gets out of their life pod and sees the wrecked aurora in the middle of a barren ocean, it'll probably grab their attention and make them want to swim there first. However, the remains of the aurora are highly irradiated due to a leak in the engine core, making an unprotected approach impossible. Whether the designers used radiation to solve this issue specifically, or if it was only a side effect of story beats that were already planned, it's a brilliant use of a mechanic that uses effects players can grasp to guide them along a path, instead of simply putting up invisible walls in the way. Now that I mention invisible walls, you won't find those at the edge of the world in Subnautica like in most other open-world games. Instead, it's explained in the narrative that the section of the planet that the player has crash-landed on is a volcanic plateau, and as such has very steep cliffs at its edges, which serve as the edge of the game world. This serves two purposes. First, by connecting geography to game mechanics, Subnautica is able to logically explain why there are limits to the play area without feeling artificial, and that helps keep the player immersed. On top of this, it leans into the horror feel that the game tends to pull on by scaring players away from going out of bounds with a sheer drop at the edge of the world. Of course, immersing the player in an alien world wouldn't be very effective if there wasn't any aliens around to fill it with. In Subnautica's ocean, players will find many different kinds of creatures, many of which have analogs on Earth. In addition to being easier to draw inspiration from than more abstract concepts, using animals that players are familiar with as the basis for the aliens in the game helps to immerse them in the environment because of their seeming familiarity, while twisting these familiar concepts just enough to make them feel new and interesting. Subnautica doesn't stop there though, because many of the creatures in the game don't only serve to immerse the player aesthetically, but also on a mechanical level, by feeding into the primary gameplay and progression loops. At a basic level, like most survival games, small creatures form the basis of maintaining your food meter. Various kinds of fish in the game can be grabbed up and cooked for this purpose, and rather unique to Subnautica is how water can be gained from animals too, rather than found in the environment like in most other games in the genre. Because the ocean of Planet 4546b is filled with non-potable water, players have to look for specific sources like they do with food. In this case, bladderfish can be caught and used to create filtered water from their bladders, which they use to propel themselves. In order to make new and better equipment over time, players will need to understand the behaviors of several creatures to get vital resources from them. One of the first dangerous animals players will meet as they search for materials is the crashfish. This type of fish hides inside sulfur plants that are typically found in the same caves that players will be searching for minerals in. If the player comes close enough, they'll emit a loud sound and rush out of the plant, towards the player's location, and explode, taking chunks out of the player's health bar in the process. It takes a bit of time to adapt and avoid them efficiently, but when players do, they'll find a valuable item, cave sulfur, left behind inside the sulfur plant the crashfish rushes out from. Being able to gather cave sulfur will be an important skill early on, as it's used to create multiple key items like the laser cutter and repair tool. Players who take note of the behaviors of Subnautica's creatures like this, more and more as they play the game, will be able to make progress more quickly than those who aren't as observant. Another example of this phenomenon happens when players move into the dense kelp forests and begin to notice another creature interaction that needs to be accounted for. The stalkers that hunt in this biome frequently pick up metal objects like titanium or salvage from the aurora. When they do this, they occasionally drop their teeth, which can be used to create enameled glass, an item that's used in many of the more advanced recipes in Subnautica. This behavior can also be useful in avoiding stalker attacks, since they can be distracted by metal objects dropped by the player, allowing them to make a safe escape. Interactions like these can be found all around the planet's ocean and help it feel like a real, lived-in place that could exist whether the aurora had crashed there or not. This helps fuel the feeling of immersion that Subnautica builds up across several of its systems and mechanics. Many games that struggle to immerse players in their environments could take quite a few lessons from Subnautica. Rather than rely on countless user interface screens and abstract ideas to convey information, the designers of Subnautica were able to successfully teach the player how to interact with their world, while at the same time making it feel like a tangible place with understandable rules. Don't get me wrong, it's still one of the scariest games I've ever played, but the way Subnautica was able to immerse me through its mechanics is something that seems to be much tougher to pull off, and I think that deserves to be celebrated.